Chapter 19. To Save Ali. Our first few days living with the pastor passed uneventfully as we adjusted to our new surroundings. He and his 14-year-old boy lived in a rented farmhouse on a beautiful piece of Missouri wilderness. My wife and I would sleep upstairs in the loft, while our 4 children would share 2 rooms downstairs. But on one of the first nights, Annika suddenly awoke me from my sleep. "Honey," she breathed into the darkness, "I've had a terrible dream." What she saw was the pastor's wife, who was no longer living with him, turn into a vampire and bite deeply into Annika's neck. I knew my wife received dreams when Yah was trying to relay something very important, so I was determined to find out what had actually happened between the pastor and his missing wife. Early in the morning, the pastor and I would head out in a small car, packed to the gills with boxes of nutrients, supplements, and all natural health solutions. We would spend the rest of the day driving to different health food stores throughout southeast Missouri and northern Arkansas, delivering various orders to his customers. On one of these bright early mornings, as we drove on a winding road through the thick green of southern Missouri, I ventured to ask the pastor what had happened. "You guys seemed so in love when we visited you 3 years ago," I said, shaking my head. "What happened?" He explained how his wife had left him many times throughout the marriage, complaining about the hardships of the ministry. This last time, she had left for 3 months and then finally returned in tears, begging forgiveness. "But Yah told me not to forgive her," the pastor said, "so I told her she was not welcome back home." Recalling Annika's dream, and now hearing this pastor's story, something did not sound right. Yet, try as I might, I could not put my finger on it. What I did notice right off is that far from the jovial person I had remembered from 3 years ago, he now seemed very moody, distant, and withdrawn. I wasn't about to challenge a pastor who had been walking in the Torah and the Spirit years longer than I had about a word he had received from Yahweh himself, but even so, something deep down inside unsettled me. That first Shabbat was an overwhelmingly joyous one for Annika, myself, and our children. About a dozen people filled the pastor's living room, and there were even a few families with little ones. For 3 years in California, we had virtually gone without any sort of fellowship, so this was like crystal cool spring water splashed into our faces, refreshing to the core. The House of Israel Fellowship, as the pastor had dubbed it, with a sign hanging on the living room window with those very words etched into white cardboard, had the custom referring to each other as brother and sister, something Annika and I were unfamiliar with from the West Coast. There was Brother Gene, bushy white beard, eyes that twinkled with joy, lean but tough, telling me stories from his adventure-filled past. There was Sister Joan, a kind woman who had often had new books about the Hebrew roots of the faith, and of course never forgot to bring her fresh goat milk for our little Naomi. And there was Brother Lee, in his late 40s, dark hair starting to gray, with a thin dark beard and clear blue eyes. Over the next several weeks I would grow closest to him, as he would share with me how the Spirit was working in his life. His humble, warm attitude was in stark contrast to the withdrawn moodiness of the pastor. On that first Shabbat, the pastor announced, "I want everyone to remember that this place is not mine. This is Yah's, which is why I call this fellowship the House of Israel." The words were comforting, and over the next month and a half, as I would continue to work for the pastor and Annika would settle into a routine of homeschooling the children, my unsettled feeling drifted into the background, almost completely forgotten. Then the Feast of Tabernacles arrived in mid-October of 2006. Excitement buzzed throughout the farm, as about 15 of us pitched our tents and campers across the pastor's farm. We would have joy, celebration, singing, and most importantly, fellowship. That first night of Tabernacles, while I was playing with my children in the living room, a very strange incident occurred in the kitchen. Annika had been busily preparing a meal for everyone, but the pastor objected. "Annika, I thought I'd asked you to make spaghetti for tonight." My wife shook her head. No, I'm cooking up something else." "Well, I prefer spaghetti," he said. "Sorry, I already got this cooking." She smiled and continued with her tasks. I had vaguely overheard the exchange, but in all the excitement of the celebration had not thought anything of it. A couple hours later, I was seated around the campfire with Annika, Broly, and a few others. Annika had brought out her guitar, and we started singing some worship songs. "It's just not the same as it was last year," Broly sighed and shook his head. "Should be more people to join us in singing around the campfire." About an hour later, as I was heading back to my tent, the pastor called to me. "Daniel, I need to speak with you and your wife." I quickly found Annika, and we met the pastor in the cool darkness under a large oak tree. In the bright full moon, I could see the grim expression on his face. "We've got a problem here. I'm seeing the same type of rebellion that was in my wife, Wright, and Annika, and this needs to be dealt with." My thoughts reeled backwards over each other, my heart raced, and confusion ballooned through my mind. What are you talking about? I had asked your wife to make a certain meal for this evening, and she copped an attitude and refused. I've seen this before, and I won't tolerate it. I've worked hard to make sure the people of this congregation enjoy sweet fellowship, and I won't have it ruined by your wife. I had no idea what to say. I was both dumbfounded and shocked. I'm very sorry, Annika said. I did not mean to offend you in any way. I was just already in the middle of preparing a meal and didn't want it to go to waste. Let's just make sure we're keeping our hearts pure, he said before stalking away. Annika smiled at me as we headed back to our tent that night, and I thought maybe this little misunderstanding, a misunderstanding which seemed downright silly to me, had blown over. But as we lay in our sleeping bags, I felt my wife begin to sob. I held her close in the unspoken darkness as she continued to weep. Something was very, very wrong. After Tabernacles, the rainy season began in earnest. Southern Missouri turned into a soggy, dripping landscape. Though there continued to be tension between the pastor and my wife, it seemed to lessen, and my own confused state of mind increased. I knew for a fact Yah had called us out here to Missouri, but for some reason, rather than experiencing joy and warmth, it was as if we'd entered a cold tomb. Had I misheard Yah? Was I not supposed to be here? What was going on? One Sabbath morning, Sister Renee happily exclaimed to everyone about a spiritual breakthrough that had occurred. She was in her 30s, married to a quiet but kind husband with a few children of their own. I've gotten rid of all of our plates and dishes that had images on them, she said, just like the pastor teaches about the second commandment, not having any graven images. I had known for many years that this pastor interpreted the second commandment to mean you should not watch or own anything with images on it. I had long disagreed with him on that issue, but it had never become much of a conversation piece. In fact, as I began to live with the pastor, I began to wonder if maybe I had been wrong, and his strict interpretation of this commandment was in fact correct. However, as the rainy season continued, and I continued to help the pastor with his health business, he would stop at various video stores and purchase movies. Often after a hard day's work, the pastor, Annika, myself, and his boy would settle into the couch to watch an entertaining flick. I thought nothing of this until that Sabbath morning when Sister Renee happily announced her spiritual breakthrough. It was then that my mind began to perceive a very concrete sin in this pastor. He was teaching one thing while living another. In fact, as I began to ponder on what had transpired over the past several weeks, I realized the pastor was always careful about never mentioning his movie watching to anyone in the congregation.